Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to close out our session on finishing the race. So let's start with a prayer and then we'll talk a little bit. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all. Help us to feel your presence deep within our hearts, that every thought and every action is inspired by your wisdom and is an expression of your love. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Because I think I only mentioned it at the beginning, I'm going to say again where the name Finishing the Race came from. People comment on these videos, and I try to respond to the comments that are that activate a response. Some are just comments that are complete in themselves. And someone talked about, why do we even think about it as a race? What are we racing against? The origin of the phrase "finish the race" is from when Saint Paul, after a lifetime of enormous tapasya, which means austerity and self-sacrifice, to carry the word of the life of Christ to all those who would listen. It was actually St. Paul who created Christianity in the sense of Jesus was Jewish, and everybody, all his disciples were Jewish. And after he died, at first, everyone thought that this was just another expression of Judaism, because the rest of the world was pagan. Pagan in the sense of not understanding Sanatan Dharma, actually, not understanding the Satchidananda source of all reality. But when there was too much controversy within the synagogues for the followers of Jesus to be able to really deliver the message in the way they wanted to, Paul just went to the Gentile world, to the non-Jewish world, and he started sharing the teachings with people who were not Jewish, which is why you read in the letters of Paul these enormous conflicts about whether you have to be circumcised in order to be saved by Jesus, which when we read it now, it is an incomprehensible debate. But the actual debate was whether or not the salvation promised by Jesus was available to people who did not follow the Jewish laws. It was a very important discussion. But Paul was persuaded. Basically, Paul was determined to share the message of Jesus, and he went wherever people would listen. And when he couldn't get traction in the synagogues, he just left the synagogues and went somewhere else. Not all of the disciples of Jesus agreed with him. He was somewhat in conflict with his own gurubhais during much of his lifetime. In other words, it was a very tough life, and he was stoned and driven out of town and occasionally imprisoned and vilified, and it was not good. And in the end, there he is in prison. He's about to be decapitated. And he just sighs and says, well, I've fought the good fight. I've kept the faith. I've finished the race. And then he just walked very courageously to his death. Finished the race, and the race is between my aspiration for God and the force of Satan, if you want to call it that, however you want to name it, the downward pulling force that is always trying to deflect us from our divine intention. And that's the race. I often have thought of it when I was growing up. The idea of drag racing was somehow sort of more, not that I was ever even remotely close to it, but it existed. It was a teenage phenomenon where two cars would be side by side, and they'd go on some open track really fast to see who could get ahead of the other. And maybe there were other rules to it, but that's as much as I know. I often felt, I feel it less, I have to admit now, but especially in the first decade or two of my spiritual life, I felt like I was always in a hot rod race, and my bad karma was one car and my good karma was the other, and we were just vying for ascendancy the whole time until, finally my good karma could cut off my bad karma, cut in front of my bad karma and slow it down. But I always felt them vying. I think I still do. I know that I still do. I would think of it more now like the two forces of my nature. They're just always vying for ascendancy. So the idea of race, in the sense of speed contest, not genetic characteristic, is still in there in the sense that one has to understand that it's a constant effort. That this just isn't like we can just go to sleep and it'll work. The specific context of what I'm about to say was actually how to have happy relationships and get along with people, which is also requires far more effort than we think. And I remember this was one of those very discouraging teaching experiences that I had where I gave this 3-hour seminar. I just poured my heart into trying to talk to people about how to love and be loved, and what a serious endeavor it is. And then at the very end of it, this I think it was a man comes up to me and said, "Well, but you never talked about those kind of relationships that are just as effortless as falling off a log." And it was just like, where have you been for the last 3 hours? There is no such thing. We don't attain great wonderfulness um, by reducing our energy to nothing and just floating through life without any willpower. Everything worth having in life requires willpower, requires tapasya, requires focused dynamic energy. But here's where the two seemingly conflicting theories come together. Once we understand that, once we understand the nature, the true nature of life, not the delusory, I wish it were like this nature of life, that word tapasya, it takes on a very different meaning. Once when we were watching a movie from India that was subtitled, the character said tapasya, and the subtitle said devotion. And this was in the early years of Ananda when the whole community was 30 or 40 people, and we all burst out laughing because none of us thought of tapasya at that point as devotion. They seemed quite contrary to each other. One was misery and one was joy. It was a joke that when you asked Swami for a spiritual name, you just really prayed that the word tapasya was nowhere in your name. But uh, he never did name anyone Tapasyanand or anything like that, although as time passed. Well, anyway, so when Swami heard us laugh, he didn't interrupt the movie, but later on he said, "No, that's a perfectly valid translation, because what it means is using your willpower to offer yourself into a higher reality. And so why would that be a bad thing to do?" Oh, yeah, that's a good point, sir. One of the characteristics I noticed about Swamiji is that tamasic energy is tamas, rajas, and sattvic energy. Tamasic energy is just sort of effortless, sinking down to the lowest level that you can do without putting out any effort. Rajasic is merely restless, and it can be directed upward or downward. And sattvic is peace-inducing, calmness, and joy. But Swami never enjoyed tamasic energy. He never enjoyed just completely shutting down and being lazy and doing nothing. Doing nothing for him was, like inviting people over for dinner and having incredibly wonderful, spiritually stimulating conversation. I mean, he would sometimes read a novel or sometimes read a P.G. Wodehouse, but his idea of tamasic was the bottom end of sattvic for me. Anyway, did I say the top end of sattvic for me? That's what I meant to say. It's just like we lived in different worlds, but it was because that's what he enjoyed. And over the years, I've seen that what I used to think of as effort is now not effort. It's better. I'm spontaneously inclined in ways that I was not spontaneously inclined before. I don't want to overstate that. But there's certainly I can, and it's thank God I can look back to 50 years of ashram living and see that I'm actually not the same person. It's very encouraging. Now, all of this is related to what I wanted to talk about today in just sort of bringing this to an end. I think we're calling this death in daily life, which is, I hope you don't mind my slightly, I don't mean to say morbid sense of humor, but I have a very relaxed attitude toward death, at least in theory. And so therefore I can speak of it easily in that way. I'm thinking of something funny that I wrote into Light Bearer. I'll just tell you a little bit of this incident. When Swami was in India, he often, especially in the first years, he had terrible health. He was doing a great deal of tapasya. He was running a lot of karma through his own body to help the people who were helping him and to help make energy, create energy for the founding of Ananda's work in India. And as a result, he went back and forth to the hospital quite often. He started having what is called congestive heart failure, which is a pretty terrible phrase, and it was exactly what it was. The heart is unable to keep up with pumping the blood, and if it's allowed to go unchecked, the heart can't sustain it. So the extremities would swell, he would become short of breath, he would become very tired, the heartbeat would become erratic. It was serious. Then the only way to get him to stop working was to take him to the hospital. And there was this small private hospital not very far from where the ashram was. So on a regular basis, Swami would go to that hospital. When he would go in, it would be like checking into his favorite hotel. The whole staff would wave to him. He had his usual room. They even took him to his usual room. And all of his staff had the whole method in place because Leela, the woman who cooked for him, would continue to cook his meals. And it was close enough that she would just cook them and pack them and bring them over. And somebody would stay with Swami 24 hours a day. So then they had the system of who would stay and how they would work it out. So I happened to be there when it was time to persuade Swami to go to the hospital. And Swami never particularly liked going to the hospital. He would accept it as necessary, partly because he wanted to extend the tapasya as much as possible. And also he preferred being home. So this conversation started about 8 o'clock at night, that his nurse, Miriam, who was always with him, said that they really needed to take him to the hospital because his heart was failing, and she pointed out to the swelling in his legs. He knew, but he just didn't want to go. And so this dialogue went back and forth, and it was like, but we never go before 2 in the morning. If we go like at 8 at night, it's so convenient. Part of the rule of going to the hospital is that you have to wait until 2 in the morning and wake everyone up and make it very inconvenient. Miriam agreed that that was the custom, but there was no requirement, that it was possible to go in a convenient way. And then they talked about whether or not he needed to go in an ambulance. And there was discussion of the ambulance. And the reason Swami wanted to go in the ambulance was because then the driver could play the siren. And Swami said it made him feel important to be going down the street and have everybody pull to the side so he could go through. But the ambulance cost a total of $15, 15 American dollars. But Swami also, they didn't think an ambulance was necessary, so they could go in a taxi cab. And then Swami was lamenting the fact that, but then there would be no siren. So Dharmadas and Nirmala promised him that they could go in a taxi and they would make the noise of a siren all the way to the hospital. And all of this, we were just laughing and laughing. And he said, well, what do they have in the hospital that they don't have here? And we talked about all the different, the chaplains could come. Chaplains could come to the hospital. And then we talked about that he could have a Catholic chaplain come, he could have a Protestant chaplain, he could have a Muslim chaplain, he could have a Hindu pujari, a Roman Catholic priest. We could have all of them. They could all come to him in the hospital. And then someone, and I don't know who, said that then when Swami died, he could be the corpse of all religions. So we put it, which we thought was hysterically funny. I'm not sure it was so funny, but we thought it was just the funniest thing we'd ever heard. We often referred to him as the potential corpse of all religions after that. There was nothing morbid about it. It was just, it's going to happen someday. You might as well just incorporate it into your thinking about life. And when you can, humor is, as Swami said to me, humor is the ability, humor to a certain, good-spirited, kindly humor, clean, kind humor He said, is to a very large extent a spiritual quality. Because what you're doing when you can make a joke like that is that you're stepping back. Instead of being so in the middle of reality that you can't see any other perspective, you just step back. And you can just see it from a wholly different point of view. Then you can sometimes be very lighthearted about what you wouldn't be lighthearted about if you were so enmeshed in it. So one of the things that we really need to bring into our lives is just this very calm and happy acceptance of the fact that everything changes. And one of the earliest aphorisms that I remember from Swami, from hearing like in 1969, was I think written in one of his books. The only certainty in life is change. Most people do not like change. Therefore, most people suffer. So I've always been a very practical person. I haven't always been able, of course, to control my emotions, but practicality seems important to me. I remember once I had become very sad about something that had happened. This was very early on. I was very sad about a change that had taken place that I wasn't pleased with. And it made me weep. But I realized that what had existed before was never going to come back together, certainly not in this incarnation. That circumstances and people and opportunities, it was absolutely gone. It was just gone. No amount of wailing and weeping and wanting on my part was going to change the reality of the situation one iota. And therefore, if I were going to weep over that loss, I would have to weep forever because there was no natural endpoint to the grief because it was gone. Now, I know that time has this weird effect on grief, which is something that I really don't quite understand. I mean, I can say it, but I don't deeply understand it. If it's sad now, why isn't it sad forever? But it isn't, because we just, it gets overlaid with other griefs and other happinesses and it goes away. But the it is still there, the essential disappointment. And so at that time, I just realized that was a very impractical point of view. To just hold on to something that will never return and just constantly weep and whine and wail and wish, to use the alliteration there. I'll just have to cry forever, and that didn't seem like a very good plan to me. So this is Swamiji's essential idea that change is what we resist. I mean, so much of the time when you really look at it, and sometimes it changes for the worse, that's a fact. I often have said to people when they were talking about some situation, they didn't know what to do, and I would sometimes say, well, something will happen. And they would often hear me to say something, something better will happen, some good will come out of this. No, actually, I'm not really saying it'll get better. It could easily get worse. But something will happen because something always happens. It's the nature of life. Life is flux, life is change. There's 1,000 aphorisms in every language in the world because everybody who pays attention notices that once today is over, tomorrow is not today. So a tremendous discipline on the spiritual path. Well, it's put out in certain ways. There was a very, very popular book when I was getting onto the spiritual path by Richard Alpert. It was called Ram Dass. Be here now. Be here now. It's very interesting if you pay attention to your own life to see how much of the time in your life you're not there. You're dreaming in the past, you're imagining the future, or you're just unconscious in the present, which also happens. But dreaming of the past, imagining the future. And then the problem is, you see, it's always now. And so if we develop the mental habit of not being here now, then where are we ever? If you can follow all of that. And this profound and deep resistance to change, we get it all set up, and we have this foolish idea that just because I want it to stay this way, it will stay this way. It's very good to examine these ideas and think, how did I ever get that idea in the first place? Like, who promised me? I've sometimes joked that we come into this incarnation and we write a contract. I've had a lot to do with lawyers over the course of time, various litigation situations. It seems like lawyers are always needed. Some of my best friends are lawyers. Some of my relatives are lawyers. Um, the and they're very exact, and they cover every contingency. And when you write contracts, you ask for a simple solution, and you get 20 pages of very dense type covering every single possibility. Well, I feel like sometimes we come into this incarnation and we've written this contract and we've explained exactly how it's all going to work this time, what we want, wish, and wail and whine for. We have it all written out. And when anything, any what do you say, any section of that contract is violated by life, we have this outraged sense that some promise has been broken. But we never notice that there's no signature on that contract except your own. You write the whole thing up, you get a black pen and you sign it. But you can present it to God, you can present it to Guru, you can present it to every saint you know, you can leave it out under the moonlight for, 5 full moons if you want to. You'll never get another signature on that contract because we're not in charge. The ego is not in charge. The soul is in charge. That's the good news. You are in charge. But it depends on what you mean when you use the pronoun I. If we mean the pleasure principle ego, no, alas, it's not in charge. Even the intelligent, thoughtful, altruistic, world-concerned ego is not in charge. The soul is in charge, and the soul is cooperating with the divine. And their objective is quite different than the ego's objective. In fact, their objective is that the ego is just going to move aside. So what the ego wants, by definition, can't possibly be correct, because what God wants for us is that we realize that we're not the ego at all, that we're not separate. Ego says, I'm separate. I have to look out for myself. My pleasure principle is the principle that counts. And the divine says, no, actually, what counts is your complete acceptance and surrender. And death is the ultimate. It's the ultimate test. Well, that's why Swami called his little essay the final exam, his short essay. It's not a little essay, it's just not long. His short essay, he called it the final exam, because all of our life habits come to a focus at the end. So why not practice now? Because there's countless little deaths every single day. Just, something ends. You have a lovely lunch and it's over. You see a beautiful sunset and it's over. You have a wonderful meditation and then it's over. And once it's over, it never comes back. Something always happens. It's not that we lose consciousness, because we're always conscious. That's the Satchitananda. The middle part is ever existing, ever conscious. We don't disappear. Something always happens, and there's always a new reality for us to embrace. And we might as well study. We might as well not procrastinate. If we just procrastinate to the last minute, it's harder. But if at every moment, imagine, every time something fades out of your life and you have a wistful feeling, think, oh, well, if I were dying now, it would be gone and I would just be moving on. What's the difference? You see, all states of consciousness, in theory, are accessible to us right now. It's not like we have to wait. Sometimes people imagine, oh, the astral world will be easier when I get to the astral world, it'll be better. When I was first starting on the spiritual path, let me just finish that thought. It's different. And apparently there are very many things that are very nice for people of refined taste. Much of what the heart longs for is more easily accessible. Beauty, music, kindness, friendship. The physical body inhibits some of the finer experiences. So it's really like being in Hawaii at the best season. That's how I think about it. Swami, in fact, he said, Hawaii, before the missionaries came, before Western civilization invaded, when they were just living their natural life, He said an incarnation in Hawaii would be like not quite incarnating onto the material plane because food and shelter, everything, clothing, everything was effortless. You could just, and everything was beautiful. You just kind of, he said it would just be like half incarnating to be there. The astral world is satisfying in that sense, but it has its shortcomings and it's not freedom. It's comfort and beauty, but it's not freedom. And those who are striving for freedom recognize it. It's an interlude, and apparently quite a joyous one, but it's an interlude. We have to come back. So death is not, death, I finally get to the astral world. It's not freedom. All we ever have is our consciousness. So eventually, why not now? If everything that inspires us about the study of the possibilities of letting go of this world, everything that inspired us reading that beautiful astral ascension prayer, it can all be acted in right now. What of us, friends, who would be remembered by you? See us as threads of light in the ever-expanding tapestry. Everything beautiful that happens to us, it's threads of light in the ever-expanding tapestry. And we will always be together with our soul friends. And that the love that we share and express in one way or another, it only grows deeper and deeper, but it changes. And the difficulty with change is that it requires energy. It's all very tightly woven together. So, everything that Master teaches us about increasing, interiorizing, intensifying, and elevating our energy. That's the answer. Because if you think about it, the problem with change is that it requires usually new, more energy, sometimes of a different type. What happens to us when we get everything arranged is that it's easier, isn't it? We know what to expect. We're supported. We've got things the way we want them. And then when change comes, whether drastic or minor, more energy of a different type is then required. So we have to, as Swami put it to me once, we have to practice when it's easier. I asked him the question of how to deal with an impossible emergency. Context was being in a concentration camp. A weird conundrum I used to worry about. What happens if the guard starts beating the person next to me? Do I interfere even if it's just going to mean the end of my life? Do I just stand by and let the terrible injustice happen? Swami said, well, in such a circumstance, you never know. You could make things much worse for everyone by interfering. So he said to me, what you're actually asking is how can you know in a moment of crisis what God's will is for you? He said the only way you can know in that moment is if you have practiced when it was easier. So that's a wonderful mantra. So someday we'll be taken away from this world entirely. So let's practice when it's easier, saying a grateful and gracious goodbye to everything that shifts, even when today turns into tomorrow. Let us just say a gracious and grateful goodbye. Be here now with gratitude and with joy. That's really what God is asking of us. God bless you, my friends.